Yeah, welcome to another episode of Safeonomics. I'm host and co-founder, host of the podcast and co-founder of Safeopedia and Safety Connect. And one of the things that we strive to do definitely with with the podcast and with Safety Connect is bring really practical advice to safety professionals. And so Dorothy Riviere, you might recognize, we had her on with Scott Coleman a couple years back, and we were talking about injury prevention solutions and technology adoption within the safety industry, with some great practical advice. And so Dorothy and I have remained connected and kept in touch. She was actually just doing a session, Ask Me Anything session with the Safeopedia community last month, I believe it was.
Yes.
And so just the relationship that's formed over time, we were kind of putting our heads together and we said, why don't we have a Business of Safety mini-series with some phenomenal guests that Dorothy has connected with. So that's what we're going to do. The next 3 episodes will be focused on Dorothy coming in as a co-host to the Safeonomics podcast and kind of helping to really have deep discussions with the guests and again bring practical advice to safety professionals. So if you're not familiar with Dorothy, she's an innovator in healthcare technology, a patient-centered care, and a strategic leader in clinical operations. And so Dorothy, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our special guest today and kick things off.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate it, Scott. Thank you. And I'm really excited to do this 3-part mini series on the business of safety with Safeonomics. And I'm not used to being on this side of it. I'm used to actually being the person interviewed. But today, I feel very fortunate that I get to be the interviewer of my good friend, Dr. Maria Silva-Palacios. Did I say that right? Silva-Palacios?
Palacios, that's okay.
Palacios. I'm so sorry. I always just call you Dr. Maria. So, and today what we want to do is really have a great discussion on the business of safety, really looking at for safety professionals, how does the business see things and how do they need to think about interacting, making decisions when there's a business side to it. And I know I'm very excited to talk to you today, Dr. Maria, and you have been a former safety manager in the safety space in the electrical industry. And I know that you are the author of Safe Zone, Cultivating Engagement One Leader at a Time. And that is certainly going to be the area that we really want to discuss today. But before we get started asking questions, we're so excited to have you. I want to give you a moment just to introduce yourself to the audience here today.
Well, thank you so much, Dorothy and Scott. It is such a pleasure to be here. And as Dorothy mentioned, I did have a career in the utility industry for some time. I call it the privilege of having a wonderful and very rewarding 20-year, actually 1 month shy of my 21-year anniversary career in the utility industry, where I served primarily as a safety professional. And I primarily supported field crews, and some office personnel as well. And then in 2020, mid-2020, right around the time when COVID was hitting, I decided to take an early retirement to focus on the last year of my doctoral program, and then finished that in 2021. And then immediately upon graduating, I focused my energy on authoring and publishing my book, Safe Zone, which you just mentioned. And then from that point on, it just opened so many opportunities, so many windows of opportunities. And I started focusing then on my business, which is called Ergon Culture Solutions, where I serve not only as an ergonomic specialist, but also as a safety culture change consultant, which is just one of my passions. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of years. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I know that Maria and I have had an opportunity to work together and speak together. And it has been so much fun to be a part of what she's been doing. But I know that prior to writing your book, you were a key part of a safety team for many years. And what is it that you feel like you learned about the business of safety during that time?
Oh, so many lessons learned in a 20-year career. I would have to wrap it up, I think, in a nutshell, right, is it takes a village. And I did mention that in my book. I think I may have prefaced it somewhere in my book, where what I mean is that the success in this business, in business safety, will happen when first there's alignment. Alignment is very critical. And especially when it comes to leadership alignment across all organizations, starting from the top C-suite, executive, and then down the hierarchy. It's important that all leaders are in alignment and in agreement about what's going to happen in terms of a safety initiative, which safety initiatives should be rolled out, how they should be rolled out. So focusing not so much on the what and the how, but the why, which is extremely critical for success. Also, the other alignment that I wrote about in my book is, and it's critical, foundational. However, unfortunately, I had found in my research and experience, it is very underrated, is the alignment between a leader's words and actions. There has to be the walk the walk, talk the talk. You've heard many sayings about this. However, it is extremely foundational for success in business and safety. There's a term called corporate hypocrisy that I researched, and that corporate hypocrisy happens when a leader's words and actions are not congruent. And what happens is that employees, the workforce, begin to lose trust in the integrity and the words and whatever that the organization leadership is proclaiming. For example, if they're saying safety first, but their actions show opposite, then that erodes trust. And so I think that it's extremely critical that there is alignment there. And also what I found, especially now in the safety culture change space that I'm working in so much in, is that when leaders have a realistic grasp of their culture, what's truly happening, that will set up any organization or company for success in safety. There has to be a buy-in and engagement across all levels, much as I mentioned in the alignment in the workforce and all across the leadership. I also find that leadership influence is key and foundational. And in my experience, I have found that many leaders don't truly understand their sphere of influence and how critical their influence is in order to have success in safety.
Yeah, and it's interesting because to me, if you are the safety person, the safety manager, and you mentioned some very important things like that the leaders need to be in alignment and they can't have that kind of corporate hypocrisy. If you're the safety person and you are, working upward vertically, that it needs to be there, but you can see that it's not. What would you recommend that a safety individual who may not feel like they can own all of that, what would you recommend that they do in terms of communication or demonstrating to people above them that maybe is a problem as to why a program isn't working?
Great question. During my entire career as a safety professional, and then later diving in deep into what makes an organization successful and what promotes and sustains engagement, I found that the communication is key. And recently I was interviewed and I spoke about the importance of communication, because I've also seen that one of the challenges is either miscommunication or no communication at all. So it's kind of like this pendulum, swing of either there's none or a miscommunication, and both really are very damaging to an organization. And so I think that keeping the lines of communication is critical. And then being transparent with what is being communicated, because employees know, the workforce knows when leadership, their direct supervisors are not being transparent. And that again begins that corporate hypocrisy erosion that occurs with trust. And not to say that safety initiatives and programs can't survive that, but the chances are minimal, because trust is at the core of everything. The relationship building and trust being at the center is just about everything. And that sets the tone for success.
I was just curious, sorry to jump in.
No, I was going to ask if you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, if it matters, or if you've noticed any difference in your research between like the true hypocrisy where they say they care about safety and their actions clearly demonstrate that they don't, versus they say they care about safety, it seems like they do, but they just don't have maybe the accountability structure or the aptitude or ability to lead those initiatives. Have you seen a difference between that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. There is definitely a link, there's a connecting theme between that. I think that leaders in general, we wake up every day wanting to do a great job. We wake up every day wanting to keep our people safe. So the intent, I go back to intent. The intent is there. I think there's just this communication gap between the intent and the execution of the thought, of the action. And so sometimes I believe that many leaders don't understand that there is such a thing called corporate hypocrisy. And I go back to my point about there's fear of influence. Because we're all human, right? We're all capable of making mistakes, even though we have the best intentions. So I see that across the board. I also see that I came from the utility industry, as I mentioned, and there is a need for thou shalt not do this compliance. Yet I do see, because people unfortunately can die from an incident, right? There's a serious incident or fatality. And so it is important to have compliance. But what I do see and have experienced over time is that there sometimes is an overemphasis on rule enforcement and not emphasis on what you just mentioned, the accountability, the shared accountability, the cooperation. So I truly believe there has to be a marriage of the two, the marriage of compliance and cooperation, because cooperation is the one that's going to be sustainable. Great question.
Yeah. And then, when you decided to do your research and to write your book, I found it really interesting that you really honed in on employee engagement. And I'm curious what made you choose that particular avenue to focus your book? And then can you give us a couple of really interesting findings that are a part of the book that you ended up publishing?
So during my career as a safety professional in the utility industry, more often than not, and because of my kinesiology background, my undergrad degree is in kinesiology, I was always part of committees or spearheading committees, somewhere I had to do with initiatives that were focused on the reduction and or mitigation of soft tissue injuries, because our soft tissue injuries for my entire career always was 60 to 80% of the injuries in the company were soft tissue injuries. So there was always initiatives, to support that or to mitigate those. And so I saw many programs come and go. I launched a lot of programs. I brought in some programs. I collaborated with coworkers to bring certain programs in to the company. that were going to be aimed at reducing those soft tissue injuries. And what I quickly noticed is if there was a really great launch, you know, you had the buy-in and all of those things that I mentioned, and the employee, the workforce was excited about it. There was excitement and there was a great launch. So what I noticed and the theme throughout the many years was that it kind of went this way and then it was just like a roller coaster downward. And that became such a point of frustration for me because there were some excellent programs that had been sustainable, I think it would have made a huge impact in the reduction of our soft tissue injuries. However, the trend was that it was here and then down. So I became very frustrated. So I focused my energy in my dissertation topic was employee engagement in organizational injury prevention programs. So what I did with that is my research consisted of not only, you know, academic research, but also my qualitative research that I conducted interviewing the workforce utility linemen across the 50,000 square mile radius of this company who were suffering or had suffered 80% of those 60 to 80% injuries. And I wanted to hear it from them. I wanted to hear it from them. And that's exactly what I heard was that they lacked engagement for multiple reasons. And I'm gonna dive into that. So that was at the core. I had a mentor who said to me, whatever you do, whatever you're going to conduct your dissertation, your research on, make sure it's something that you are seriously passionate about because you're going to do a lot of reading and a lot of writing and a lot of research. And he was spot on. So I chose that. And then to answer the second part of the question was the research, the qualitative interviews and everything, what it did for me is that it confirmed all of that, of the gut feeling that I had all along. I always knew that there was a engagement sustainability challenge because I saw firsthand where the areas where there was success in launching the program and sustaining the program, the leadership was so bought in and engaged and participated. And then in the areas where it wasn't successful or not successful at all, where it just kind of died and dwindled, the leadership, direct and middle, were nowhere to be seen. So they weren't participating at all. And the other, another theme that came up too is that there were no participation expectations. So there was no mandates around what the expectation of participation was to be. Some areas said, oh, we're going to have it mandatory. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean? And then in some areas, they proclaimed that they were not mandatory at all, or the initiative wasn't mandatory. So those are kind of the takeaways on in the book that I write about.
Scott, do you have any follow-ups on this particular area you're interested in?
No, I think it was great advice, obviously, to focus on what you're passionate about, because I can't imagine the amount of research and reading and interviews that you conducted to complete the PhD program. And the employee engagement, it makes me think that it's ownership as well. Like we've had other presenters really talk about, if you can push the ownership out to line managers and to frontline workers, that's when you're going to see the real adoption and sustainability of a program. So does that go hand in hand in your opinion?
Absolutely, I have to agree with that. A couple of years ago, and I even mentioned this in my book, I attended a union conference, and one of the guest speaker, or one of the keynote speakers, was I can't remember the top of my head, but it was about extreme ownership. And the philosophy was that there has to be an extreme ownership and then a shared accountability, a shared ownership, but it has to be extreme. It has to be, you know, this is I am as a leader or leaders, regardless of the level, I am responsible for what happens in my organization under my watch. Whether I'm present in the moment or not, the onus falls on those leaders. And in the research that I've done, the leader who has the most influence over their workforce is the direct. So we're talking in terms of utility linemen, for example, that would be the foreman. That's the direct, the first level, the hierarchy level in the organization. And the foreman, I remember in my experience, they didn't understand that they had such an influence over their crew's behavior and their crew's engagement or lack thereof. So I agree 100% with your former guest.
And do you find, because some of the audience might be connected with really large organizations, but some of the audience maybe is more connected with either a very small business, 50 or less people, or even your medium-sized businesses. And do you feel like, I mean, obviously your assessment that the immediate leader, the foreman, whomever, is one of the most important people, but are there any other pieces of advice you might give to people who are part of smaller organizations if they either want to put a program in place and ensure engagement, or if they're struggling with it today?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh, excuse me a second. As you know, apologize for that. Yes, absolutely. So the advantage that I believe and I've seen in my research and experience is that a small to medium-sized business has over a large business, a mega corporation, is especially when it comes to the creation and then execution of some form of a safety initiative. They have much more of an advantage because there's usually less levels in terms of the organizational hierarchy and the approval, the levels of approval that one needs to seek in order to roll out a program, for example. So I think that that's one key advantage that they could utilize on an everyday, day-to-day basis in their work. Because I know when I was in the utility industry, it was almost as if there was a committee that was created to discuss about the committee that, so there was a committee for the committee for the committee. And so it was really difficult to implement something that was great because of the so many levels. And sometimes what I saw is that it kind of just put the fire out eventually, and it lost that momentum. So small to medium sized businesses, I think, have that advantage.
Nice. And then you also said that sometimes there's a lot of layers that a large business has to get through. And I mean, what advice would you give people who are on the opposite side and they are the people that are navigating through what seems like endless layers to try to either get a program in place or one that's not performing well, that they may feel like it's such a high climb that it's difficult to actually make any type of impact. What advice might you have for those people?
I would say I go back to what I mentioned earlier in terms that it takes a village, because it can't just be done, in safety. So I also witnessed that everything falls on the lap of safety. The onus is always on safety, where the reality is that safety is everyone's responsibility. And when that is communicated, and not only communicated, but then role modeled, there's success. It's foundational and critical, that alignment, across organizations, and then the words and actions, as I mentioned, and then for leaders to have a real grasp of their culture, as I mentioned, because I've come across leaders who, unfortunately, are not that aware of what's really happening, because they are focused on what the higher level leaders are saying, and the intention, right? We go back, I mentioned this with Scott, is the intention is there. The company's website, there's the values and safety first. However, sometimes that's not really what's occurring, what's the entrenched culture. And so it's important that leaders understand and have a real pulse of their organization and some of its culture. I think also, I would say, let's see, well, I did allude to that, which was the modeling of the behavior that one wants to see. That it goes really right back to the words and actions aligning.
Yeah. And I think maybe you touched on it a little bit, but like safety in the grand scheme of things is a younger discipline than, say, finance or HR. And I think what we've seen in those areas is that, the finance team's not responsible for doing the budget necessarily for the department, right? Mm-hmm. And the HR person is saying, hey, you should be hiring the people that you want to work in your department, and I can support you. And safety's still kind of left out there on their own a little bit, being responsible for safety, when really the operations and management is responsible, and safety's there to support them and the programs. And I think that went to the Safety on the Edge conference, and that was a little bit of the theme, and it seems that we're talking about it more, but I think for that sustainability and that engagement and ownership, we need to kind of push out that responsibility a little bit. I think that's kind of what you were talking about a little bit.
I am. I'm talking about the sum of the parts equal the whole. And I think that many times, and what I've experienced is the working in silos. So everyone works in their particular silos and not understanding, which is part of the theme that I mentioned about leaders needing to understand and have a grasp of what's really occurring in their culture. And part of that is cultures that are working in silos. And so ultimately, when it comes to safety, there are multiple organizations within a company that are working towards the safety goal, whether it's the fleet, whether it's fleet management, whether it's compliance, whether it's equipment ordering. All of those groups are working for the shared mission, And if a leader, a great leader, will come in and have that emotional intelligence to say, okay, all of us are working toward the same goal. We all have ownership in safety. It's all of our job. There's this shared extreme ownership, and it just catapults an organization to another level when that occurs.
When you find that, because you mentioned that leadership, it's often they might not even be aware of the subculture that exists. They believe, maybe they even have their main words, their keywords on their wall, that this is what we stand for as an organization. But they don't necessarily take the time to maybe talk to frontline individuals, or find it maybe to be a challenge to determine what the true subculture is. How can a safety person who is definitely closer to the front lines, they can see what's going on every day, how might you recommend that they either bring that information upward? Like, what's a way that might be successful for them to do that? Or is it simply that you feel that they need to take ownership of getting those leaders to come down and have those conversations to learn it for themselves?
So in my experience and also in my research, a lot of this, I discovered that it's being able to have that open door policy. We always hear about, oh, I have an open door policy, but what does that really mean? You know, what does that mean? Does that mean that regardless of the level of leadership that you're in, do you have that psychological safety? Now I'm going to touch on a whole other thing, which is psychological safety. Is there psychological safety? Do I feel as an employee safe and to share my thoughts in a very respectful yet assertive and transparent manner, what the concerns are? Do I have that ability to go whatever level up to communicate something that I'm experienced or witnessing, or perhaps my workforce is sharing? So I go back to the relationship. It's about the relationships from the top all the way to the bottom. Is there trust? Do people feel psychologically safe to come without feeling like there's going to be any form of reprisal? That is the key. And I know it sounds very simplistic, and it is simple in theory. I think in practice, it's much more difficult because many things, you know, as a leader, we have pressures. All levels of leadership have pressures of some sort that are coming from higher above. So I know, for example, the frontline leaders who I've worked with and have supported, they struggle with leading effectively, understanding their sphere of influence and leading their workforce, but they also have struggles with any pressures in terms of time pressures, pressures for productivity. In the utility industry, there are sometimes schedule outages, so you only have this time frame to conduct the work and make sure that it's done safely. So there are all these behind the scene pressures that frontline leadership have. And so the goal is just improving those relationships so there is honest, transparent, and assertive dialogue about what's really happening in the culture.
I feel like that might be one of the toughest aspects, is to try to truly understand kind of the culture. How much do you believe that, you know, within particular industries, we can take the energy industry as an example, but that even a person's previous background, I worked for a company where maybe there wasn't psychological safety, there wasn't even a focus on safety. And now I come to a company where initially what I'm hearing as the person that's doing the work is that people now do care and that they want my feedback. How would you overcome kind of the previous history that a person might be bringing into a new industry who may feel like, I'm not sure I trust this? How do they go about building that trust within environments where people may have had really bad experiences in their past?
It's a great question. My suggestions would be that you start with being the person that initiates that relationship. And it is difficult because our past molds us and shapes us in how we conduct ourselves in relationships in general, right? And then definitely in the workforce. So I do think it's important to have that caution, but it does have to be a healthy caution. And so there could be that room to explore that, okay, this is an issue and I'm responsible for what assumptions and beliefs and attitudes and experiences that I've brought from somewhere else. And then be objective about what's really happening in the culture. Is it me? Is it me that I'm just bringing in this? I'm going to say baggage, although, you know, there's a better word for it, but is it really real? Is it me or is it really happening? And if it is happening, then take a risk. And I think that's another aspect I think I brought up in my book was just courageous leadership. Courageous leadership where you are as a safety professional or a leader or both is that we know what our values are and we lead from those values, and then we have those values become our moral compass. So then that integrity is always what dictates how we go about our job. And so going back to the relationship building is being that model first. I'm going to model what it is that I hope to have an experience in this organization. So I hope that answered the question there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously that, I mean, you did your PhD on this topic and wrote a book about this topic, and it's a pretty big issue. When we're talking to our audience members, they're rarely saying, I want to learn how to conduct a confined space training session better, or a fall protection. They're talking about, how do I get management buy-in? How do I get employee engagement? So just knowing that, there's some people I found, in safety that are my vintage, didn't get into safety intentionally. It was sort of accidental, or they were voluntold. So they're really experienced, have great technical expertise, but maybe they lack some of those softer skills that are required. And then we have the other end, new people who are entering, who might have had some of that training in university or college, but lack a little bit of experience. So just talking to those two groups, for the gray hairs out there like me, what kind of, other than reading your book, because we're going to definitely suggest everybody pick up a copy of your book, but what kind of course or learnings could they focus on, to help them build that confidence or that courageousness in going into management meetings and trying to be, hold people accountable and build that integrity. And conversely, for the younger folks, what areas could they look to focus on?
I was thinking about this the other day. A question came up to me about, I think it was a young lady who has been relatively new to the safety industry with no technical experience. And how is she able to establish that credibility in an environment where there's such a heavy focus on technical expertise? So I was like, wow, I don't know if she read my book or not. I said, but read it, because there's a lot of things about that, as I do share my personal story. And I was one of those. Scott, I was one of the people in safety, and actually the only one in my safety organization, not in the corporate space, but when I actually began to support the transmission and distribution folks, I was the only safety professional that didn't come from the line work. I had never, climbed a tower, climbed a pole, dug, and any of the work that a lineman does, I had no clue. And so I had a very difficult time in the beginning, establishing my credibility with the line workers, because I didn't have that. But it also helped me because I just wanted to know what they did. I wanted to learn the work that they did. So I took that opportunity, and that what I thought was a disadvantage, I turned it into an advantage for me, because I wasn't the safety police in their eyes, because I didn't know what they were doing. I didn't know. I knew the basics, like you have to wear your goggles, your safety glasses, you have to wear certain gloves and what have you, but I didn't really know the work. And so I had a huge disadvantage, but I came in, as I said, and it was all about relationship building for me. It was about, okay, I'm going to utilize my gifts, which is I truly believe now is in fostering trust-based relationships. And I began to hone in on that and applying that into the crew visits, getting to know the guys. By the time I left that utility industry, I knew I was invited to birthday parties, divorce parties, weddings, birthday, I mean, you name it. I was part of the family. And it all started with me just taking the time to get to know people, who they are. And I'm a true believer, and I do share this with leaders in companies who I work for or as a consultant, is just get to know your people. You know, we're human beings, and at the end of the day, we want to be heard, seen, valued, respected. We want to feel like we belong. We want to feel that, hey, what we're doing is contributing to the bigger picture. So if leaders can focus on the importance of that, and how the power of the vulnerability of being vulnerable, improving your emotional intelligence skills. So that goes a long way. And I'm going to give you a little bit of data, because I know I'm always looking at some form of data and statistics. And so the research shows that approximately 70% of companies provide a health or safety prevention program of some sort. However, less than 50% of employees engage. So then also another startling stats is that less than 5% of leaders have emotional intelligence. So can you imagine? Less than 5%. So you have this enormous percent of people who are leaders, who are leading people, sort of just, throwing a dart into thin air and not knowing where it's going to land, because they lack that emotional intelligence. So my suggestion to them is, don't underestimate the power of developing those emotional intelligence skills. Pick up a book about emotional intelligence. However, authentic leadership is the framework that I utilized as well in my book. And authentic leadership has 5 dimensions, and that is leading with your heart, creating trusting relationships, leading with purpose and passion, and self-discipline. So if leaders can focus on those, and also values, what are my values? I can't tell you how many leaders I've come across when I've asked them on the spot, what are your values? They'll start proclaiming the values of the company. And I said, no, what are your personal values? And they don't know. And so I start there. I say, well, explore, what are your values? What motivates you? And then live by those values, as I mentioned earlier. So it's being intentional with leading with those values, the vulnerability part especially. It's important that leaders understand how important it is for their workforce to see them as humans, because we all are. And I think, unfortunately, what happens, the pressures of being a leader, sometimes leaders become very robotic, and they forget that I'm human, and I need to let my workforce see that about me, and then just share some things about myself to humanize, right? To humanize ourselves with our workforce. And then empathy. I can't even say enough about empathy. Leaders, empathy is known to be one of the top 3 emotional intelligence attributes that have the power to transform relationships and organizations.
I know we've spent a lot of time going in a lot of different areas, and I was hoping before we get kind of to the end, where again we are going to recommend that people pick up your book, but there are times where safety managers are rolling out programs, and it, for whatever reason, is going well for most of the people in the room, and then there's that one person or those couple of people who not only are they not on board clearly, but they are actually ruining it for everyone else in that room. And I think it's a really common situation. So I was wondering if you could provide any insight or advice as to what people might do when they're not just dealing with someone who doesn't trust, but truly someone who is sabotaging the situation for everyone else.
I have so many stories, Dorothy. I've come across it multiple times. There are people in a culture, in organizations, who have so mentally checked out. And the research shows that employees don't quit organizations first, they quit their supervisors first, their leadership first. And then in time, it's eventually they retire or go somewhere else. And there are people who feel that way and can continue working because that's just what they have to do. And then there are people who really will put a lot of effort into sabotaging. And to your question, I had an experience that I have shared before that took me off my game for a little bit, but then I realized it had nothing to do with me. It was this employee who was just so disgruntled and would sabotage anything. I was in the field promoting, I was training actually, I was leading a training on reducing the soft tissue injuries. And a lot of the gentlemen, because primarily it was 80–90% male, that who were the naysayers, it would usually be in the back of the room, and they would have their arms crossed, which, cross arms, and they have their glasses on, their dark glasses, and they would just sit in the back and would pretend to sneeze, and then the sneeze would come out with some foul something, and they would sit in the back. However, in this particular experience, the person was sitting right to my left front seat, like immediately front seat on the left-hand side, my left-hand side. And every single time I would begin with the purpose of the program or what we're about to do, he would just have no problem sabotaging it, heckling. He actually became a heckler. And so the way that I handled it and the way that I would recommend anybody going through this is validate them. I understand you're not happy with this, and just kind of smooth it over to where you can maybe de-escalate them. What I did was exactly that. And then during our break, I just went to the supervisor and I said, this is what's happening. And this particular person is sabotaging. And I addressed him as well and said, I understand that this is how you're feeling, part of my validation. However, there are other people who do want to participate and are here out of their own volition and they want to learn. Well, that didn't work. And so eventually I did go to the supervisor, and then he was asked to leave the room. When by the time we came back from break, he was no longer part of that group. And that happens. And I'll tell you, that was a learning experience for me. And it did shape me, like I said, took me off my game for a little bit. And then I realized, this has nothing to do with me personally. This is his battle, his experiences that he's bringing in. Unfortunately, one person could have an influence on the rest, especially if that particular employee has a lot of credibility in terms of his expertise, his years in the company, or his expertise level. And I also want to just add that I remember being in big safety meetings with the different levels of leadership, and the leadership was always recommending that we would just exclude those naysayers because it was such a small population. Well, I was like, I beg to differ. I think we need to explore why they're naysayers. Because typically those naysayers, as I mentioned, had a lot of experience and people followed them. So my goal was, and which I did at the end of my career with this particular industry and this particular organization, was I developed established relationship with those 4 or 5 that really made it difficult to be a safety professional, and turned it around. And my argument to the leadership was, if we can get these guys, everybody else is going to follow. And that's exactly what happened.
And I love that you brought up a couple of things there. You talked about really the authentic leadership part, and there's 2 parts to it. The first is, if you have people that you're in the middle of a rollout and they are simply not just not listening, they're actively working against you. Most people love to try to just ignore that situation they feel uncomfortable, even as the person leading it, as the safety person may be, to lean in and deal with that situation. But I think that courageous leadership, authentic leadership is knowing when you have to actually lean in. But then I think you pointed out something else that's really important, which is not just letting that go, but then saying, here are the people who are the most the highest level detractors to whatever it is that we're trying to put in place. And I'm going to go one-on-one with those individuals. And I'm going to take the time to try to get to know them, try to understand, and see if I can turn them into believers into the process, knowing that they have that level of influence. And that whole piece, that whole story that you told, I just really wanted to double click on each of those pieces, because I think therein lies almost coming back all the way around to where you start, to say how you need to understand yourself emotionally and use your values, and then lead from that area, developing that trust. It kind of brings all of it together. And Scott, I just wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to add or ask a question, but I really want to double click on that. I think it's really important what you just said there.
Yeah, no, I'll turn it back over to you. I think I was thinking along the same lines. So
yeah. And as we're getting close kind of to the end, Maria, is there anything that, we haven't asked about? I know you've been a part of podcasts in the past. Is there anything we haven't asked about that you're like, you know what, this would be really interesting for the listeners?
No, I think we've covered a lot and it's great, but we can go, on and on. It would go on an entire different podcast just about authentic leadership and what it takes to get to be because that's a lengthier subject to dive deep into each of the attributes. But what I really want to do a little bit more, just kind of piggyback on the things that I said and the fact that you picked up, was the importance of those naysayers. And in my experience, and I felt like I was always swimming upstream without a paddle, because I was always like rooting for the underdog, and I was always being told, you don't know what you're talking about. That, just leave those alone. Those are just 4 or 5 that they don't matter. They'll weed themselves out. And I couldn't buy into that mindset. They said, you root too much for the underdog. And I said, because coming from a place, again, of authentic leadership is that understanding that everybody has a story. Everybody comes in with a previous experience, which is one of the questions that you had, right? How we come from this experience and we bring that into organizations and relationships. So if everyone has a story, I think as a leader, it is key to understand and get to know those employees as to why they're thinking that way. Where along the way did you become so sour, and why, and what can I do to change that? And if I can just have one more minute to share this one story that was really impactful for me, is there's this one gentleman, I do write about him in my book, and he's one of the stories, is that there was no one else in that organization that was more sour than he was. It was just really tough. He made it really, really tough. And very stereotypical. The glasses, the cross-arms, the cigarette, at the break, and he just told me, I want nothing to do with this, and blah, 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 blah. I can go on and on and on. However, he was one of those guys that was really respected. And what I found out is that this guy's wife was dying of cancer. And shortly after me discovering and finding this out, I just realized, wow, so not only is this guy coming into work, working these crazy hours, he's already sour on the company, sour on the organization, but his wife, he goes home to take care of his wife who's dying of cancer. So as a safety leader, I now reframed myself in my communication with him. And I'll tell you, the beauty of that relationship, I did go to his wife's funeral and invited by him. And I also was just so grateful that we established this relationship. And one day after a meeting, was feeling really defeated because I was having issues with the leadership. He came up to me and he said, for whatever it's worth, I just want you to know that we as a crew respect you. We know you have integrity and you are really well respected from our crew. So for whatever that's worth. And I wanted to hug him. Like, I was just like, wow, I was at the end of my rope. And I'll tell you, I'm going to end with that, because that's the power of establishing relationships that are centered on trust and empathy.
Well, that's an amazing story to, I think, end with. So thank you, Dr. Maria, again, author of Safe Zone, Cultivating Engagement One Leader at a Time. We believe everybody should go pick up this book. So could you tell the audience where they might be able to get this book?
I am on Amazon. So if you click on Amazon and look for Safe Zone and you see this orange with the yellow lettering, that is my book. I have it in paperback and in hardcover, and I believe Audible already. I'm not sure, but yes, that just go straight to Amazon.
Well,
Great.
we appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
You're so welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me as your guest.
Yeah, and I'll also add, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your experience. I will encourage people to reach out on LinkedIn as well and connect with you. As Dr. Maria mentioned, she does do some consulting now. So if you're you wanting to get going on something like this, not sure how to get started, I think definitely reaching out and making that connection would be a great place to get started and get some motivation to be moving yourself and your organization into the right direction.
Thank you.